40 women, specifically. My co-chairman is stuck in traffic, which is not unusual, so he'll be turning up later on. The first lecturer is Professor Belaisch. Are you all right? Very good. Nice. That's just the pleasure of meeting her. And she's from France, and she'll be talking on the management of infertility over 40. A very topical subject at this time.
Thank you very much, sir, and thanks to the organizing committee. Of course, I have no conflicting interest. I'm sorry I'm a little ill, as you will hear it. Starting a family late is, you know now, a societal phenomenon, and there are many reasons for women to choose to delay having children, as you know. Better availability of contraception, education, need to meet the right man at the moment the right man agrees to be a father, and mainly the ignorance of the decline of fertility with age. And decline of female fertility with age is well demonstrated, as all of you know, in spontaneous fecundity, donor insemination, all infertility treatment. However, women and men are not aware of age-related fertility decline, and mainly in women with higher education. And so how can we deal with this? Prevention, information, to speak about age-related infertility decline in women, the risk of delaying childbearing, the age-related fertility decline in men too, but how to take in charge and until what age. So the first important point is that infertility evaluation is compulsory as early as after 6 months, not as usual 1 year, as it is well said for definition of infertility. And all the committee, American one, you may see the ISRM, the English one, the NICE, and in French, the Society of Gynecology and the College of Gynecology, all of us, we say, after 40, it is after 6 months and not 1 year that you must begin the evaluation of the infantile female. What is the specificity? Quick and effective. Of course, the first important point is to determine the real duration of infertility, not only to ask, since when do you want a baby, but what was your contraception before? Because very often, the duration of infertility is much longer than people think. The ovarian reserve over 40 is much more important than in young patients. Of course, vaginal sonography, male evaluation, uterine tubal evaluation, and laparoscopy only if the tuber's problem. As I say, evaluation of ovarian reserve is much more important over 40 than for 25 years and so on, ladies. And I show you our own result in my IVF center in Sèvres-Saint-Cloud. During 3 years, we have done 17 oocyte recoveries, and we look that we just have 81 clinical pregnancies and only 49 ongoing pregnancies. And when we looked at this ongoing pregnancy, as you may see, there was no patient with an FHS greater than 10 and an IMH lower, only one with an IMH lower than 1. And so now we decide that we agree only to take patients in IVF over 40 if they have a normal ovarian reserve, not really normal, FSH until 10, with E2 of course lower than 50, and AMH greater than 1. And we try to explain to all the patients over 40 that egg donation would be the best alternative. So first, quick infertility evaluation. And after, we propose you to decide there are 4 situations. 4 situations. First, lady is 40, but the desire of child is long-standing. The couple was not in a hurry. They decide to wait, and then it is evident that it is a real infertility, and it is not due only to age. And then IRT will be more effective than nature. Second situation, lady is 40, but there is a male or in tubal infertility, endometriosis, dysovulation. Evident, IRT will be better than nature. The third situation, she is 40 and she had a beginning, or less or more, ovarian failure. than it is more oocyte donation. But the most usual situation is she is 40, the desire of the child is very recent. We don't find any explanation except she is 40. And this is the problematic situation. And as you know, it is well shown, when the lady is greeting in age, the proportion of unexplained infertility is increasing. So, if we summarize, infertility at 40, what do we offer? There is a real explanation to infertility. Of course, IVF. Tubal infertility, either IVF or surgery and IVF. Ovarian failure, it's easy. But the problem, as I was saying, is we don't find any explanation, but she is 40. And then, what can we do? Let nature tell its course, ovarian stimulation and intrauterine insemination, IVF, ICSI, or egg donation. As you know, usually for unexplained infertility, there is a traditional clinical approach, step by step. But is it really the optimal management over 40? Of course, no. If we wait, we wait. Spontaneous fecundity at 40 years. I remember you, it is not zero, but it is very, very low. Ovarian stimulation for unexplained infertility, either clomiphene or gonadotrophin, we know it is not the right treatment, and this is useless, regardless of age. So the real problem over 40 for all this infertility without real explanation except age is, have we to do intrauterine insemination or immediate IVF? And it is a subject of debates in IVF Congress since some years. And you see that most of studies shade, also low in absolute term, IVF is more efficient. So if we look at the study, there were three very good studies. The first one is the one by Rendola. Look, it is a randomized clinical trials, and you have either clomiphene intrauterine insemination or FSH in EU or immediate IVF. And as you may read, the per cycle clinical rate is quite in favor. Sorry, I'm looking at forward. It is exactly that the best is IVF, of course, immediate. The following study was the study by Fauser. It's a retrospective study, but the conclusions are exactly the same. Look, IVF is more effective than ovarian stimulation. And they well say that citrate of clomiphene citrate should be omitted over 40 years. And the more recent study, the study by Goldman, is another randomized study, and the conclusions are always the same in favor of IVF, immediate IVF. So we can really say that in summary, infertility over 40, there is no place for clomiphene, no place for intrauterine insemination, but immediately in favor of IVF. Okay, IVF. But we are now in customized ovarian stimulation. So what is the best protocol over 40? GnRH analog, antagonist, agonist? Well, let's be private. There is no clear data showing that the superiority of one of the other. Each one may choose, but there is no real argument in favor of one treatment. Just one word, there is no place over 40 for natural cycles. As you may see, pregnancy rate over 40 is very, very low, so that very often natural cycle is given to this lady. Sorry. In France, study by FIVNAT showed that in fact the best results were with GnRH analogs in long protocol. But as I said, you may find a lot of studies saying the opposite, so that doesn't matter. There is no really good treatment over 40. Addition of LH, it is really discussed too. The amount of gonadotrophin, we very well know that it is not useful to increase gonadotrophin amount, but of course we take into account the age of the ladies. And we have to take into account weight, tobacco, and so on. In my experience, we have chosen to keep long protocol for these ladies with half dose of agonist and HMG from 300 to 450 units per day. But we have to keep in mind that even if IVF is better than intrauterine insemination, it is very low. Look at the mean delivery rate. 42, it is 5 to 6%. So we have to wonder, is it really defendable? And this is an old sentence I found from De Roy and Belaisch again, what is the social cost of infertility over 40? And if we look at financial issue, we see that, for instance, in France, where IVF is quite free of charge in a public hospital, we may ask, is it really appropriate to spend public money on patients with a very poor prognosis? And we may really wonder, if the patient pay, do the IVF, if they had to pay for it, will they do or not? It's clear that protecting fertility center success is not an ethical basis to say no, but we may say that including a patient with a very poor prognosis in an IVF program provides a false hope, and this is really important. Of course, the alternative is egg donation, but egg donation is not the solution for every people. As you know, not in Spain, thanks very much, but in France, oocyte donors are in short supply, and some ladies really want a genetic lens. So it's clear that now we cannot speak about fertility over 40 without speaking of oocyte vitrification, and now it's a reality. And of course, the age banking, there are a lot of arguments in favor. Of course, there are some arguments against. You are lucky in Spain, but in France, we are not allowed to do it. And society cannot avoid reflection. And there is an ethical aspect too. Do you really think it is acceptable to encourage women to undergo IRT with their own French oocyte so that they have just 5 to 6% of pregnancy, so that they could have a much better pregnancy rate with oocyte Fauser? So, to conclude, I would say, first point of infertility after 40. The infertility evaluation is compulsory after 6 months and not 1 year. And it's very difficult to say it in France. I hope it is more easy here, but not for us. Also low, in absolute terms, IVF is more efficient than intrauterine insemination. Of course, all of us, we know that medicine cannot be restricted to patients with good prognosis. But the best, once more, is prevention. Inform women and men about the spontaneous decline of fertility. Make pregnancy easier for young women, but I know it is not so easy. And if really we want to help women, egg presentation should be allowed in all countries, facilitated and encouraged. Thank you for your attention.
Professor Belaisch, it's very interesting actually. When I start discussion, I have to go and give evidence in a constitutional court case on November the 8th on why our law does not allow women over 43 to go for a straight IVF, ICSI. We're not allowed oocyte donation. So maybe these are a few tips for my evidence. What would you say to that? In a country that does not allow, be it NHS or be it private, they do not allow a woman over 43 to go for a natural sort of IVF. Is it sensible? Is it reasonable?
I am not sure I understood your question, but for instance in France, it is not forbidden to do an IVF over 43, but it is not free of charge. So that usually for 4 attempts, it is free of charge. But if you are more than 43 years, you may do an IVF with your own oocyte, but you will have to pay for it, and the pregnancy rate is awfully low, so it is not really useful.
Yes, well, this is the question, isn't it? Should you, for their own sake, stop them proceeding, or should you not?
Me, I don't.
You would not be. That's it. Okay. Questions? Okay.
This is Cano from
Alex, yes.
You mentioned that there were no pregnancies when the FSH is over 10. But we know that the FSH also fluctuates. So if we were to do an IVF pregnancy when the FSH is lower, so keep repeating it until it's lower, is there evidence to suggest that it's better?
You are right, it fluctuates, but the fact that it is high once is of low prognosis, we know it. And we were astonished because in my center we have a lot of women over 40. As you see, we have 500. And when we looked, the pregnancy rate was so low, and when we looked at who were the women with a pregnancy, we saw that we had no women with ongoing pregnancy. I don't say clinical pregnancy, because we have, of course, but ongoing pregnancy in our IVF center, when they have both FSH and IMH bad, we had no ongoing pregnancy. It's the reason why we decided to do that.
So just the finding of one elevated FSH means zero.
In the real life, we do, as you say, we do a second FSH, and of course, lady want to try, you are right, if the second FSH is lower, if the estradiol level is not greater, otherwise that doesn't mean anything.
Faustina.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to put you a question about if there is a maximal age for embryo transfer. As you certainly are aware, it was published in France by René Freeman, an important book called Le Droit de Choisir, where he advises very boldly that after 48, no embryo transfer should be performed. And the ethical committee of the North American Society advised last year that the maximum age should be 45. I know that 45 is not 45, as you said very well, the ovarian reserve can change into different people in the same age. Thank you so much.
It's a difficult question. The College of Gynéco-Obstetric in France, we said about oocyte preservation that a limit is necessary. We had a lot of discussion about 45 or 50. And the ethical reason we said until 50 is if a woman is 44 and she's obese, hypertension, diabetic, we should say yes because she is less than 45. She is 45 and 1 day, but she is young, thin, without any medical problem, we should say no. So at the end, we say the best is to take back embryos before 45, but it is possible until 50 if the lady is in and knows there's a problem for baby and for herself, and if she have a good health. So we said until 50.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Belaisch. I think we'll have to go to the next speaker. I think this is a very interesting talk. Thank you. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my long-standing friend, Professor Lachowsky, Michèle. And she will be talking to us. She's also from France, and she will be talking to us on the women over 40 years old in our century.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. And thank you for coming, although it's not raining, so I think it's really interesting. So, we are talking about the famous woman over 40. You know that we all get older, that old age is coming for almost everybody now, and more for women. I show you that in France, but you could do the same in your country, of course. Well, do you have the feeling that there's a conflict of generations? No? Or yes, maybe, but I think no. But there's a big difference every 40 years. It's a rich history of being young, being old, and feeling different from one another. Being a woman is a different status in our society now. Question of health, general, specific to women, of course, life, waste, and quality of life. But are we talking about a woman or about women in general? That's very nice to look at, but impossible to read. But I was very proud to make it, I left it. So what's over 40? Is it after something? Is it before something? 45? Meaning before 50? Meaning before menopause, of course. Let's say the word, before being old. Is it the last stop before age and aging? Well, the question is, over 40, is it an end or a beginning? 40 is usually considered as a milestone. Often very satisfying when looking backwards. There are achievements. You think that means something when you are talking about a woman over 40?
It's like this. It's artistic. We're in Barcelona. things aren't always straight.
Well, I was speaking about achievement. That's not an achievement, but let's go on. Well, after 40, at old age, you can have problems or interests with family and society. You like to give a good image. Maybe you have a good image. Body around 40, maybe not reason yet. Our woman, she looks much younger than her grandmother at her age, even as her mother. And she's allowed to have a proud and good sexuality in our time now. Well, still our society is quite different, and there are major changes for women for society. Do you think we consider women as a human being? No different? Of course, there are lots of differences, but not real difference, sociologically speaking, with a man. Women's image is much different. It changed maybe every 10 or 20 years, but it's very different, of course, from my youth and your youth. Her role in today's society is important. You are looking at her way of life, her demands, which are great and maybe greater every day. She is looking at her image, her own body, which change, of course, and she is looking at herself in somebody else's eyes. Our woman doesn't agree with yesterday's popular wisdom. You know, you had to suffer to become pretty or beautiful, you suffer to become a woman, and you suffer to become a mother. Today's woman, she can be a loving wife and a skilled lover. She has to be a good mother, and she usually manages the 3 items. And she has usually a rich professional life. Or maybe we could say a professional life at home and on the job. Her past is different. She has known contraception all her life. It's an evidence, no problem. It's her decision, which is something very important. But fertility time and duration, that's what Joelle just talked about. She thinks about nature and her genes. Art is necessary. She thinks she's protected. Either she wants children and she will have art, for instance, PMA, or she doesn't and there's contraception. So her sexuality should not be impeached by wanting or not wanting a child, which is implicit. Menopause, that's something to be talked about, especially after 40, of course. Not being exactly under 40, I need my spectacles. What does she want? Does she want to have a kind of prevention? How will she know when she comes to us and says, how will I know about my menopause, about what I should do? She still thinks about periods or no periods. Not to have to bleed. Is that a loss, or is it something of the contrary, which is, of course, entering an unknown country, but maybe having a better life? In her past, periods were something which were a label for women, a stamp, they were marked, including, of course, data corruption, which is not very pleasant. We were told it's as old as humanity, but is it unchangeable, unvariable, not to be tampered with? Is it really a very important, indispensable, essential endpoint? Presence, absence, do we have any proofs? Blood, is it that important? Of course. But our patients now ask lots of questions about their periods. It's not such a impossible thing to lose or not to have. It's absolutely necessary. That's what I ask. Is it useful? Well, how, where, and when? Is there really a justification for that discomfort and its inconvenience? Is it really absolutely necessary? What about sexuality? Sometimes it's an impatient. Well, 40, 45, no difficulties, contraception. Oh, on the contrary, they were what one of my friends called sleeping beauties. They just thought they had time. They were looking so young, but they forgot that her ovaries didn't look so young anymore. So they waited, and maybe, as you heard and as you know, they waited a little bit too long. Sexuality needs a partner, and that age is not so easy. Sometimes it needs hormones too. And sexuality, I'm sorry, I forgot it, that it was in French, but I'm sure you understand. But it's always a question, why is it still in our century, before or after 40, so difficult to talk about sexuality? You can think that for the doctor, sometimes he feels it's not his job, he doesn't know how to. The woman is sometimes almost ashamed. She doesn't want to talk about something so private. So it's not so easy, although it's a very important part of a woman's life and of a man's life too. But again, what about man? If he's still present, or again, back. As the saying goes, it takes two people to dance a tango. But maybe men are now a little afraid of women, even if they are what the cosmetics industry calls mature women, because you can't be old. Our over 40 woman, she has a great dilemma with age and aging. You know, our society doesn't accept aging. You have to be young. And if possible, you have to be young, slim, suntanned, with money. It's not given to everybody. So how to advance, how to go on with life without those problems, marks, and a less beautiful image, which is something very difficult. And in our century, we don't have the right to show that we are aging. You know that hyper-medicalization of our society and the trouble with our present doctor-patient relationship, especially in France. And if our patient listen to us, look at us, and want to know things with us, you know, of course, that internet is very important. It's very important. Internet, Google, as one of our French doctors said, that it's the keys to the medical temple. You know, the way our patients come to us with some papers that we haven't read and have special ideas about how they should live and how we should help them. Around 45 is a different question. Feeling well, strong, even powerful. They have 45, usually job achievements, more or less, pleased with what they did, and they feel in full possession of their present and their future. And I asked a few of my patients, I made a kind of trial study, and they told me it's the best age. Maybe not young anymore, but not old yet. We know what we want, we know what we are. Of course, it's not youth and adolescence, but it's not old age either. And one of them said, it's bliss compared to what I lived before. And we can go even further. Later than 45, it's an aging population, which is focused, of course, on physical fitness and internet technology. A good life with still lifelong possibility. And of course, you don't even have to go to a special surgeon. There are so many cosmetics, prosthetic, virtual, and really a lot of things you can do just not to look old. You are allowed to be old, but you mustn't look old. That's quite a big difference in our society. This slide, I can say thank you to Farouk Al-Alawi that he gave it to me. And I think it speaks from itself. Look, men and women have almost the same wishes for their life. And what's more important is being healthy, of course, but a good relationship, not only with the spouse and partner, but with friends. That makes a real life which is worth being lived, if I may say so. Of course, we mustn't forget about financial security and spiritual well-being and a satisfying sexual relationship is at the end, but it's not the less important, of course. But I think now we've talked a lot, but I think it's time to meet Mrs. France over 40. I forgot her middle name. It's middle class, so it is Mrs. France, middle class, over 40. She's 48. Her parents were happy, young. They were listening to the Beatles or to Simon and Garfunkel. They had no problem with job or everyday living. They were enjoying peace and love with their friends. She chose the way she wanted to, what she wanted to be. She studied with by her own choice. She took the pill. She took boyfriends too. Girlfriends that she still values and still sees in regular hen parties, as the Americans call that. And they eat sugar-free cupcakes. While their husbands, oh yes, I forgot to say that Miss over 40 had a big church wedding. Her husband supports his club with friends, beer, and pizza. She has a good job. She earns as much, and sometimes more than her husband. But she struggled sometimes by sexual harassment by her chief at the office. She had her first child at 29. Then she had an abortion. She forgot her pill while caring for her mother, who had a breast cancer. But she's well now, don't worry. Then she changed for her first IUD, glad to stop hormones, of course. IUD is a natural way of not being pregnant. She still wears the same jeans as her daughter, with the same holes at the knee, of course. Around her 44th birthday, her husband left her. She wouldn't tell me if it was for a man or for a girl, the age of her first child. She now lives with a new companion who has 2 young children. Her role as a mother and a part-time stepmother is not as easy as she imagined. Of course, they wanted a child of their own. No problem today. But it did not work. They even tried everything, but only in single age. We didn't want more. Now comes the difficult perimenopause, premenopause, and she remembers when her family and friends told her how unpleasant it would be, how unpleasant she might be. Everybody in the family remembers that aunt who had menopause and so on. She finds she has one advantage now. She doesn't bleed anymore, and that will stay from menopause on. She doesn't come to us to ask for more periods. That's not the problem. But hot flushes during a meeting where there are more men than women. Maybe, doctor, you could give me some plants and soya or whatever. Well, now she has to think about her image, about seduction. If she's still seductive, she hasn't lost her passport for love and real life. Difficult. She doesn't even, sometimes she wants to talk about it, but she doesn't. Doctor, I think it's time to talk about age, and is there a prevention that I could use? She will probably live after 90, even more. She might go to 100, and she will outlive her partner, usually, if he doesn't smoke too much. Well, our 21st century over 40 woman, I think she has much better cards in her hands than ever. Not speaking about the problems about climate and everything, that's true, but she still has very good cards in her hands. Maybe she could think about that period, not as winter, but as Indian summer, which is much nicer to think about. Maybe we could help her to realize that, to live and love. And to say encore, the French word for again and more, which is, I think, one of the loveliest words in the language. Of course, that maybe she might thank all her healthcare people, because we did something for her. And now I hope that you have the feeling that I did something for you. And I thank you for your attention.
A very elegant talk as always, and very informative. I wonder if there's any comments that one would like to make.
I have a question.
Yes.
Congratulations, Michèle, for your lecture. Very nice. I would like to know your opinion about these children that, our patients, when they get pregnant at 45, let's say, by egg donation, they will be like 60 more or less when their child will be teenagers. So what's your opinion on that, on how this could affect to these teenagers?
It's a very good but very difficult question. And when they come back to us, the mothers and the fathers sometimes, saying it's very difficult because at his or her school, he or she was asked or was told, your grandmother is waiting for you outside. It's very difficult to bear. And they also forget, they only see the wonderful idea of being a mother and staying young because they have to for their children. But I don't think it's a very, absolutely of Joelle Belaisch on her side, because I think there's a time for everything. I wasn't the first to say it in the Bible, but today, with all the progress science made, and with the feeling that our friends, patients, or whatever, have, that everything is possible, to think that the limit, there's no limit anymore. You can just push the limit. Be clever enough or rich enough to do it. But I understand your question, maybe they don't think enough about the future of their child. But who are we to give them a lesson? We can help them, saying, for instance, that it won't work. But difficult.
Thank you.
I think actually it's very easy for us to say women are delaying their families for selfish reasons or for whatever. I think there are real social economic reasons that is making it very difficult for people to start a family when they are young. And I think this is neglected because we are always saying, okay, the women, and there's this connotation that they're being selfish in their careers. But I think it's very, very difficult. If you look at the socio-economic conditions, the price of housing, for example, the price of childcare.
So many mothers with no father for the children.
Exactly. So I think this is the fundamental problem, really. The socio-economic realities that we are living in, which makes it very difficult for a young couple to start having their children when, as you quite rightly said, is the appropriate time.
But I think it's very difficult, especially for us healthcare people, to say no.
No, of course not.
And we also see it like our own failure.
Yes.
It's nice to be God and to say yes to everything and to be able to do everything. We must also forget about that and not to be afraid to say no.
No, we cannot say no, but the socio-economic realities are such that when somebody is confident, when somebody is economically stable or safe, then biologically they're over 40. But this is society's fault, not the doctor's fault. We are here to help. Thank you very much, I think.
So now I would like to introduce you Antonio Cano. His lecture is titled Imaging Biomarkers of Atherosclerosis and Estrogen Exposure, further on the window hypothesis.
Well, good morning. Would like firstly to thank the scientific committee, presidents for the invitation, and the society. And I should say, well, firstly, I have no conflict of interest regarding the topic of my talk. And I should say that I'm happy that I have listened to Dr. Lachowsky, because I am going to speak of that over 40 French lady when she grows a little bit older, 50, and to comment about an issue which is very important regarding the management of these women, which is chronic disease, and particularly cardiovascular disease, which has been a little bit the center of the problems we've got with the use of hormone therapy in menopausal women, as a result of, you all know, the WHI study, in which the use of hormone therapy was associated with an increase in the risk of cardiovascular disease. So I will divide my talk in 3 areas. One in which I will just comment about estrogens and vascular wall as a contest, the window hypothesis, which is something that you will find that after those impacting data of the WHI has been the matter of new thoughts and hypotheses that are being studied. And for that, the second point will be the use of new tools that we have to disclose whether finally, during those early years of menopause in that French lady, which was so healthy, which so many life expectations, if the use of hormone therapy might have something to do with the evolution of the progression of atherosclerosis, which you all know is the biomedical background of cardiovascular disease. And I will just comment a little bit about those useful tools to clarify the window hypothesis, and which is the conclusion of all that. So this is something that was published in 2002. Actually, this is a publication of 2003, but that was the cardiovascular data of the WHI study, in which you have 2 slides, 2 graphs, one on the left, which refers to coronary heart disease, and the one in the right is about stroke. And you find pretty clearly that women who were randomized to estrogen plus progesterone, which is the blue line, had an increased risk of both cardiovascular coronary heart disease and stroke. So that was pretty clear, and that was the basis for limiting the use of hormone therapy to women who were symptomatic and only for the treatment of symptoms. But we should forget about using that for reduction of risk of cardiovascular disease. But it's also true that some years later, the reanalysis of those data came to the conclusion that you have in the table. I wonder if you have the possibility of looking at the data. You have 3 columns, one on the left, which is women who were less than 10 years after menopause, in the center between 10 and 19 years, and on the right, higher than 20 years post-menopause. You see that the first line corresponds to coronary heart disease, and you see that for those women who are younger, those who are only less than 10 years after menopause, the odds ratio for developing cardiovascular disease when using hormone therapy is less than 1. So that means that hormone therapy apparently was protective for those younger ladies. And as I said, if you look at what happens with coronary heart disease, this is particularly clear. It's also something that you find when you consider both the estrogen-only group or in the middle of the estrogen plus progesterone group below in the picture, that, as I say, there was apparently protection in what referred to coronary heart disease. That was the basis of the hypothesis that probably in those young women, estrogens might be protective, because what we learned about many experimental studies concerning the action of estrogens was that in a series of targets, for example, lipid metabolism or other issues, they were protected. That was the basis for considering hormone therapy as a protective option in those women after menopause. And that was something which has been repeated. This is a slide that you probably have seen in many publications or talks, because it was the data from Thomas Clarkson, showing that depending on the age of a woman, you have there on the left a woman of around 50, and then when they grow older, you see the lumen, the vessel lumen, and also the thickness of the atheroma plaque, which increases more and more until advancing age. And when considering the options of the effects of estrogens, you have that left column over there, in which you find that the reduction of LDL cholesterol, the reduction of LDL oxidation, and so on, are all a series of impacts, of effects that are involved in the reduction of risk of atherosclerosis. So finally, the hypothesis was that probably in women who are older, the use of hormone therapy might produce the rupture of the atherosclerotic plaques, inducing cardiovascular events, while in those women who were younger, the protection was associated with all those effects that were already known about the use of hormone therapy. But that's something that was an hypothesis and that should be confirmed by further studies. That's why we are now to explore the options that we have for investigating which is the behavior of atherosclerosis according to both imaging and also about clinical tools. Concerning imaging, this is something which is pretty easy to perform. This is just something that you may do in your offices with a good ultrasound machine with a B mode, in which you will be able, when exploring the carotid, we will be able to measure the IMT, which is the intimal media thickness. And this is something which is very much related with the evolution of atherosclerosis. As I said, this is something that may be measured as a thickness, and also you may detect atheroma plaques, which are positioned at different levels of the carotid. For example, you have here two images, one on the left, in which is very clearly shown the characteristic of that plaque. You see also the calcification of the plaque at the basis with that arrowhead. And then also you may have information about the different oncogenicity of the plaque as shown on the right. So there are many data which have been obtained from different cardiovascular studies showing that this is a very good biomarker concerning risk of cardiovascular disease. This is, for example, a study in which you find there at the lower part of the table, in which you see that, for example, that thickness is very much related in that persons. And this is a study, you see there almost 3,000 subjects of the Framingham of Spring study cohort, and it's shown very clearly here that those that in the follow-up didn't have cardiovascular disease had a reduced IMT, intimal medial thickness, as compared with those who suffer a cardiovascular event. So the tool is very useful. The tool is something that has a predictable value concerning the event, the cardiovascular event. This is the same study in which it is clearly shown that for those having a plaque or not having that plaque, the difference is important. You have there the red line, those free of plaques, and the blue lines, those with plaques, and how the probability of being free of disease for any sort of cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and so on, is very clearly different. So this is a very good tool that might be used for studying whether the use, as I said, of hormone therapy might have something to do with the evolution of atherosclerosis, which would be, as I said, the confirmation of that window hypothesis. Also, you may explore directly the coronaries, and for that you need something a little bit more sophisticated, computer tomography, in which you are able to detect whether there is any problem at the level of the coronaries. You may find, for example, if there are areas of calcium, you have there how they are very clearly shown at the level of the coronary, as I said. there are more slides, and I have even though some obtained with magnetic resonance, in which you may also study whether there is any narrowing of the lumen of the different areas of the coronary vessels, and also the counterpart over there you have also the study of the pathological study showing the correspondence between those images and the proper atheroma plaques. And again, this coronary heart calcium that you have there are very much related with the risk of coronary events. This is again another study in which, following almost 7,000 subjects, there is a very clear difference between those who were with high levels of coronary calcium, as shown there. This is a score in which you may divide the population, the patients, according to that calcium, 0, and different stages. And according to those different stages, the prognosis is very different. So we have tools that may be able to distinguish which people are going to suffer one of those events. An interesting thing, for example, of these coronary calcium scores is that they predict risk even independently of age. This is something important. This is a review of one big study, the MESA study, almost 7,000 people followed for several years, and you have the women, and on the right, all coronary heart disease events. And interestingly, as is shown here, independently of age, you have different age layers here. You find that those with higher scores have the same risk, as I said, independently of age. So this is a very strong tool that may give plenty of information concerning the impact of hormone therapy. So now we have the progress and the problem and the hypothesis. We have the tools, and now let's see what we have got concerning research in the latter years. This is the ELITE study. The ELITE study is a very nice study performing, you have there 643 women who were randomized to either estradiol or placebo. And they were followed for a series of years. And interestingly here, you see there are two groups of lines, one above, in which those are ladies who were more than 10 years after menopause, and below those who were less than 6 years after menopause. And interestingly, this is IMT, intimal medial thickness scores. It may be shown that the progression of IMT was much lower on those who were subjected to hormone therapy, but only if they were young, if they were less than 6 years after menopause. So it seems it is a big confirmation of that window hypothesis in which young ladies treated with hormones might have a benefit, as shown here in the thickness of intima media. And there are also some data concerning the coronaries. You have here, this is another story. This is actually an ancillary study of the WHI, in which is shown, for example, here, much clearer at the lower part of the slide, in which it is shown that those who were treated with estrogens had lower coronary calcium at the, as shown by computed tomography. So it seems that finally, when we are considering those younger women in their 50s, the use of hormone therapy, according to the window hypothesis, might have something to do related with protection. Even there are data concerning endogenous estrogens. This is data from the SWAN study, the study of women across the nation, which you know is a multicentric cohort in the States, which is following a big number of women for many years, and there are different areas that are being explored, one of them obviously the cardiovascular area. This is data showing that depending on the level of endogenous estrogens, which are divided here in quintiles, the thickness of the carotid wall changes, and it seems there is a protection in those who are exposed to higher levels of endogenous estrogens. So let's go now to the last part of my talk, which refers to clinical biomarkers. And this is interesting that now there is plenty of data considering hot flashes. Hot flashes, you will know, that is one of the impacts of the effects of menopause that are very worrying, that are distressing for many women, and which are quite prevalent. You have here, which is a hot flash. You have three graphs in which you have the core body temperature here, you have there the respiratory exchange ratio, and you have over there the change in the skin temperature. Well, as I say, there is now plenty of data interrelating the presence of hot flashes with a series of events related with the metabolic syndrome. This slide shows clearly how the vasomotor symptoms, the hot flashes, are related with obesity, insulin resistance, hypertension, and dyslipidemia, and obviously all that related with estrogen withdrawal. And it seems that there is something to do with sympathetic overactivity, which is something I will not go into because it's quite complex and long, and I don't have time for that. But this is, as I told you, very interesting data about that. Look, for example, this is a study again from samples obtained in the SWAN women, in which there is a relationship between the levels of adipokines and the presence of hot flashes. If here, for example, adiponectin, which you know is an adipokine which is related with insulin sensitivity, and also with leptin over there, and you see how, for example, here, women who suffer hot flashes, which is in the black line, do have lower levels of adiponectin than women that do not have those hot flashes. Again, this is insulin resistance as evaluated by HOMA index, in which is clearly shown again with 8 years follow-up, again the SWAN study, in which it is clearly shown that the level of HOMA is higher in women that have higher levels of hot flashes. And even more, not only those mediators of insulin resistance, but also, again, IMT directly measure the carotid level, as you know. This is a study from the same group. This is the group of Pittsburgh, which is very much involved in this sort of research area concerning SWAN women. You see here how the hot flashes, the increase in quintiles in the levels of hot flashes is directly related with the thickness of the carotid artery wall. So it seems that there is an area of research, of interesting research over there, which raises many questions about which is the basis for associating, for example, hot flashes with all those metabolic changes, but that, as I say, is something that goes to that point that we were commenting. And interestingly, this is my last slide, this does not translate only biomarkers. This is an intriguing study which was published by the group of Tony Mikola in Helsinki, in which they follow a big cohort of Finnish women. You see over there 330,000 Finnish women, and they evaluated which was the result of interrupting hormone therapy early for any reason during the first years after menopause. And you see here that in women exposed for less than 5 years and those exposed for more than 5 years, you see how the odds ratio for suffering a cardiovascular event was increased after abandoning hormone therapy. So that's all I think raises questions, but clarifies a lot, which has been that initial window hypothesis, which was raised immediately after the Y study, but now with years we are more and more understanding which might be underneath of that action of hormones. And just to end this slide, to invite you to the EMAS meeting in Berlin, 2019, still far away, but just to make a hole in the agenda for coming to that meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. very comprehensive lecture. It's very interesting, and the window of opportunity. I'd like to open the floor to questions. Any questions or comments, please?
My question is about the moment in time that we start the hormone therapy. Okay, I think you already answered this because you showed a study where if it was more than 6 years since they reached the menopause, maybe it would be not beneficial. But do you think, is there any like threshold? I mean, when a woman reaches menopause, let's say at 45, and she comes to your consultation at 49, and she's been 4 years without treatment, would you start it?
Yeah, that's. There are two answers for that question. Firstly, if you are asking for a clean line differentiating risk or no risk, that line doesn't exist. But it's true that the older you are, the higher the risk, generally speaking. But there is also something interesting if you think of women with comorbidities. For example, woman only 3 years after menopause, but she's diabetic, obese, she suffers hypertension, for example. So she is still in the first years after menopause, but she has options to have her arteries deteriorated. So that's something you have to think about. But there is not a clear answer to that.
Thank you.
Okay, but it was the same with my question. Only I thought about to my patients who very young, less than 40, 38 and 39, and they had hysterectomy and ovaryectomy in young age, one 8 years ago and another one 10 years ago, and that period were without any hormonal replacement. And they came to me 8 and 10 years, but they before 40. And what should I do with this patient? Little bit the same as your question.
Yeah. Yes. That's true.
So,
Yes.
Some type of
Yeah. Yeah. It's not easy to give an answer, but obviously I think that in those cases, you know that in any case, this is a debate that probably is very theoretical, because you know that at the present moment we don't have indication of using hormones for reduction of risk, of cardiovascular risk. We don't have that indication approved. So finally you have to move only with symptoms. If she is symptomatic, you may give it.
Symptomatic, yes. I tried to measure it into my media complex, use non-hormonal treatment in that period, but they're symptomatic. Difficult practical question.
Yes, it is. Not
One-
easy. Just
Just one comment, if I may. I think one of the big problems with WHI was this mentality that was prevalent at the time, that anybody could use HRT, anybody could prescribe it, anybody could take it, and it took the place of every other medication that was existing in, say, metabolic syndrome. I think you've hit on the right button there. That when he said that the other women with complications of diabetes and hypertension, I think if they're properly managed with statins and hypertensives, then HRT gives additional benefits. I mean, what's your opinion on this? I mean, we have to treat the woman as a whole, not just look at the HRT in isolation.
yeah, it's true. Yes, you treat the woman as a whole. That's true, and that I think that whenever you face an area which is unclear, you have to stick to guidelines. I would say that even in any case, you have to stick to guidelines.
I agree.
So use hormone therapy for women who are symptomatic. And be careful if she's old, is something that is also reflected in guidelines, and be careful if there are strong comorbidities. And if there are comorbidities, like for example hypertension that you mentioned, be careful in using either oral or transdermal, because you know that there is a difference over them. So with all your armamentarium, you have to manage which is the best option for this case.
Would they comment? Oh, yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. My question is, do you have any database by long-term use of hormonal therapy on liver impact?
Liver?
Yeah. Let's say patient is using hormonal therapy, hormonal replacement therapy more than 5 years.
No, I mean, if there is a liver disease, this is something that has to be considered before using hormone therapy because it's not recommended. But there is no clear association between use even of oral therapy with liver disease in general. Because you know that there are always particular cases. For example, you know that there are women who are particularly sensitive to steroids concerning, for example, cholestasis. Few women, but some of them, they have problems in pregnancy, for example, and they are particularly sensitive. So those cases are those in which you probably we shouldn't use hormone therapy. But the long-term use of oral estrogen, as far as we know, is not something that creates problem in the liver.
Okay, Antonio, thank you very much. We must go on with the last speaker. So it's a pleasure for us to introduce you Bart Fauser. The lecture is titled Ovarian Aging and its Clinical Implications.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with thanking the organizers for getting me involved in this meeting. And I have to say it's quite a challenge to speak later in the morning at number 4 in a session which could go in all directions. So I didn't really know what the previous speakers would say and therefore what I could add. It's tempting to say that let's forget about the lecture and continue with the discussion because based on responding to the previous speaker about guidelines, it sounds good to always follow guidelines, but we know that the guidelines often doesn't help in individual cases. So I would say in individual cases, maybe start thinking first and then look at the guidelines, because we have to individualize. And I heard a lot so far, which was talking about groups based on age, but not on individuals. And maybe that could be the added value of my lecture, focusing on individualizing the interventions. My disclosures, I think, not really relevant for today's presentations. Ovarian aging. We know that ovarian aging is related to follicle loss. We know that there's a huge individual variability in ovarian aging, but we know very little why that is. We know more and more that it has major clinical implications, both at reproductive age and at post-reproductive age. But we have to acknowledge that we still understand very little the scientific, the biology basis of the major individual differences in ovarian aging. And I would like first to address this issue. And you know this is about, again, focusing on the average of follicle loss with increasing age. And you have to consider that the y-axis is a log scale. So the decrease is tremendous. But also you see the huge variability from one individual to the other. That is really huge. So one woman, 40 years of age, in terms of ovarian aging, may be very, very different from another woman. And of course, first we have to understand why that is, and then hopefully find reliable tools to assess that in a non-invasive way. Because of course, at the end of the day, the only way to truly reliably assess ovarian aging is count the number of primordial follicles in ovarian tissue. But of course that requires an invasive procedure and therefore is not very practical. So the French pathologist Alain Goujon, he spent more than 2 decades looking at human ovaries, human ovarian tissue, to come up with a theory, hypothesis about follicle development. And I will not go into details here. This is sort of history books, biology books, but we know that it's a long, long trajectory. So from a resting primordial follicle up to a Gravian pre-ovulatory follicle, that could take somewhere up to 3 to 6 months. And you can imagine, of course, that there's many different regulatory mechanisms during these 6 months that regulate and determine the path of this given follicle. It is not so easy to study this because it is such a complex process. And one of the things, and there has been a whole series of studies, but this is in the mouse model, the knockout mouse model. So if you presume that there are certain genes relevant for follicle development, then you just knock out those genes. And this is in the area of ovarian biology. These are famous studies focusing on factors like AMH knockout, BAX, FOXL2, P10. There's about 10 different individual factors where it has been shown convincingly in the mouse model that it gives accelerated follicle loss. So follicles are being forced to enter the development stage and then enter atresia, and therefore also a premature exhaustion of primordial follicle pool. So the human model would be premature ovarian failure, if you wish. But then, of course, it is a whole series of factors. How do these different factors interact, number one? And number two, of course, there's always the potential for species differences. What you find in the mouse, is that relevant for the human, yes or no? But of course, how to study that in the human model is not so easy. There's a series of experiments in the human actually performed by my mentor, Ernst Schuey from Stanford in California. And he very much focused on as he refers to, the hippo signaling pathway. I'm not sure whether you're aware of this. If you're interested, you can see there's a recent endocrine review. And his aim is to make these resting primordial follicles grow so they could be used for fertility interventions. I will not go into details here, but at least this shows some human data on factors regulating primordial follicle growth. Then we all know the endpoint of follicle exhaustion is menopause. You know, when the follicles are gone, you enter menopause. But we also know that there's a major individual variability in the age of menopause. And it's more or less a Gaussian curve, so it's normally distributed between 40 and 60. We all know this. But you should also then realize that women that enter menopause at age 60 compared to age 40, which we both consider normal, you know, if for some women it takes 20 more years for their follicle pool to exhaust. Isn't that interesting? And isn't that, this could give us valuable information about factors that regulate follicle pool depletion. There has been a series of studies actually led by a group in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands, on GWAS, Genome-Wide Association Studies, where you can look at DNA and SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms in SNPs. And one of the advantages of this methodology that it may give rise to totally new findings and make you think about new pathways. The downside of this is that you usually need big numbers to come up with meaningful findings. And this is a sort of a meta-analysis, as you can see. Think about it. Here you talk about 40,000 women where they looked at their SNP profile in relation to age of menopause. And they found a whole series of genes. So we know that at least to some extent it is genetically controlled. And this is not by mutations, that has nothing to do with disease, but with minor alterations in the gene structure. And then they could see that it's, and I will not go into details here, but that these are genes that they found that are involved in very general processes like DNA repair, like immune system, so again, which could tell us something about regulators for follicle pool depletion. But it's not just the genetic controls, there's environmental factors as well. This is a fairly recent review in Human Reproduction Update showing that, of course, also prenatal exposure, adult exposure, cigarette smoking, other factors. So it is not just genetically controlled, there's environmental factors also. So then what does this mean, this ovarian aging and individual differences in ovarian aging in relation to fertility? And I will be very brief because it has been touched upon by previous speakers. This goes back actually to Utrecht and to my predecessor, Professor Egbert de Velde, who already in the early 90s focused on the direct relationship between age of menopause and preceding age of decreasing fertility. This is, and we summarized this more recently with Frank Broekmans from my team, Endocrine Reviews as well, the full biological background, but also clinical implications. And therefore, as we heard in previous presentations, of course, in women above 40, fertility decreases and IVF results decrease. But believe me, in some women that are 40 years of age, that are destined to enter menopause at age 43, their fertility will be close to zero. There will be sterility already, whereas another woman of 40 who is destined to have her age of menopause at age 58, she's 18 years before her menopause, and she will probably have normal fertility. And therefore we have to I think, get away from thinking about averages. We have to individualize. And of course we have to focus on, can we find markers to reliably assess ovarian aging? So it's very relevant in where we know women 35, 40 years of age to individualize their fertility potential, both spontaneous and after treatment. And I will not go into details here. There's so much in the lay press about oocyte freezing and about oocyte donation and about the push for time. So I will skip this. And also, you must be aware of, I think, one of the breakthroughs in reproductive endocrinology over the last decade, AMH. You know, now everybody talks about it, but 15 years ago, you know, this was just non-existing, AMH in female reproductive endocrinology. And indeed, it is a factor produced by early developing follicles, and therefore, beyond any doubt, it is by far the most reliable marker for ovarian aging to date. It's not ideal, and it doesn't solve all problems, so we have to be careful. There are many issues related to assays, related to cyclicity, related to natural fecundity. You see papers being, controversial papers with opposing views being published every week on this issue. But we can't afford to be cynical and say, yeah, there are problems. Yes, there are problems, but it's certainly much better than all the other markers we have. And I'm only going to show you one study because we have been working on this for AMH for 2 decades. There's one study that I pushed my team, they were very much focused on IVF and AMH and how relevant it is. And I say, okay, if it is a marker of ovarian aging, it has to be related at the end of the day to the true life endpoint, menopause. And this is a paper you see published in JCNN by Simone Broer as first author, where you can see we focused on 185 women at that time at age 36, where we assessed AMH in the context of infertility treatment and IVF, but then we assessed their menopause status 11 years later. And I was pleasantly surprised, I can tell you, that there is a clear link. So 12 years later, the age of menopause is clearly linked to AMH levels the 12 years earlier. So for me, that was, I think, the most convincing proof that at least we have something at hand there, that AMH indeed is or can be a reliable marker for ovarian aging. Then I would like to focus on the other issue, which has not been mentioned, and then the effect of differences in ovarian aging on menopause, but also health issues related to menopause. Number one, and I was astonished, if you're interested in this area, I think this is a must-read paper from epidemiology, where they looked at age of menopause from all different populations around the globe, everywhere around the globe. They gathered all the literature, and the surprising finding is, and I think in biology you will not find many features which apparently are so tightly controlled as age of menopause. Wherever you are in the world, and whether you're tall or short or obese or non-obese, and whether you're from the Pima Indians, it doesn't matter. You all sort of have the same. Sometimes it's 48, sometimes it's 51, but it's very, very tightly controlled. So that must mean that it's very regulated by genetic control. And of course, when you think about it, evolutionary, it's not such a surprise because it is so vital for survival of the species. It's also that evidence is less robust, but it looks like, as far as you can see, that over time, when you compare this century versus the previous century versus earlier, it didn't change over time. We know that food conditions, many conditions have influenced menarche, but it doesn't influence menopause. And therefore, in other words, and I know it's a fairly controversial statement, people have criticized me for this, but you can say from an evolutionary point of view, how natural is postmenopause? Or in other words, it is only 100 years that women throughout the world outlive their ovaries. Before that, they were destined to die before their ovaries were exhausted. And I think we have to think about this very carefully. This is, I think, a moving picture related to previous presentations. Of course, we would all like to grow old gracefully and in great dignity. But reality, we know, is quite different often. We believe now, in my country, this was widely publicized, that scientists say that baby girls that are born now, 50% of them will reach the age of 100. 1 out of 2 will reach the age, and that is usually portrayed as a victory of medicine. Wow, look at what we did, how wonderful, what an achievement is this. But look at it from a different perspective and say, if age of menopause does not change, and is not going to change, and if women destined to live 100 years, they live at least 50 years of their lives without estrogens. And is that a good thing? And there's major individual variability in that, of course, related to age of menopause. And again, I will not go into details. We published this as well. When you look, and it has nothing to do with hormone replacement therapy, this is just differences in the natural age of menopause. And how does it relate to general health issues like bone density, we all know that, breast health, cardiovascular disease, mood, cognition, sexual functioning. You can see, and again, this has nothing to do with hormone replacement, this is just differences in natural menopause. It is tremendous. And this is a meta-analysis which was also widely publicized, published in the JAMA fairly recently. Again, the Rotterdam group where we're working with, where it was very, very convincingly shown that age of menopause, when you look at the hazard ratios or the relative risk, is related to cardiovascular disease. Not surrogate endpoints like IMT or whatever, hard endpoints like myocardial infarction, death, stroke, etc., etc. So age of menopause is related to female healthy aging. As sort of an experiment of nature, which we summarized in the Lancet, 7 years ago, also patients that we see often is women with premature ovarian failure. It's a fairly uncommon condition, as you know, but sort of we thought, how about their quality of life and healthy aging? And there it is very, very obvious that all the same issues, it's sort of an extreme early menopause, and you see it confirms what we see in normal menopause. Infertility, of course, osteoporosis, cognition, cardiovascular disease, mortality, etc., etc. all very strong evidence. This is a summary of work of actually an Italian, Rocca, who works in the US already for decades, where he follows up on women that underwent ovarectomy. And there he can very clearly show, and again I will not go in detail, but it's very, very clear that ovarian, as sort of a iatrogenic menopause. You bring women in menopause by removing their ovaries, and then you see if you do it at the age before 55 years, before 45 years, you can clearly see that all these same factors like cognition, stroke, cardiovascular disease, longevity is affected. So overall, and in my country now that is more and more recognized, that female healthy aging is really an issue that is under-assessed and undervalued so far. Look at the title of the slide. It's not my wording. This is a wording of a Canadian female professor of women's health. Men die quicker, but women get sicker. And you see on the left-hand side, you see longevity. This is Dutch data, Dutch statistics. The red bar is women, the blue bar is men. We all know women get on average about 4 or 5 years older than men. But when you look in the middle, the number 2, that is healthy life expectancy. Did you know that healthy life expectancy for women is actually shorter than for men? And it's even more so when you focus on chronic disease, the life expectancy without chronic disease. So how well are we doing and how proud can we be that women get older than men? And they get older in a relatively mediocre or poor quality of life. So I think it is of crucial importance that we focus on individual differences in ovarian aging, individual differences in age of menopause, and its implications not just for preceding fertility, but also for general health issues thereafter. And I would like to leave you with these thoughts. Just go over it, please. And then I'm done. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Is there any question in the audience?
Thank you so much for a very clear presentation. And I have noticed that women who come with irregular periods, irregular infrequent periods and signs of anovulation in their 30s or late 80s, that they always show low ovarian reserve on antral count more than their peers. And I wonder whether this is also a sign of earlier menopause, similar to the irregular anovulatory cycles we get after 40.
That's a very good question, and I think the true answer is we don't really know. Of course, most women with irregular menstrual cycles, they have PCOS. And we know now that evidence is quite strong that in women with PCOS, actually ovarian aging is retarded. So they get into menopause at a later age, about 2 or 3 years. For other conditions, we don't know.
Should we inform patients then that there is a low ovarian reserve seen on a scan when they are just coming for a symptom?
Yeah, and I think when you look at the scan at the antral follicle count, that is a marker for ovarian aging, but it is only studied in women with regular menstrual cycles. So in women with irregular cycles, we don't know whether we can use that.
Would you offer AMH?
For sure, I think AMH is useful under those conditions anyway, because it helps you to define the diagnosis. So yes, I would offer an AMH.
Doctor, I have another question. Do you think the use of AMH antagonists or other...
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. I'll try. Let's see if something else happens. Yeah. Do you think that the use of AMH antagonists or other molecules to postpone the onset of menopause in future is a reality, or is it just science fiction? What's your opinion?
Yeah. This is not science, this is personal opinion. You ask for a person, that's dreaming. No, it's not going to happen.
Okay, one quick question. If women are meant to die at the age of 40, 50, or life expectancy of humans is such, then why do we have such a genetic condition called the menopause? I have my opinion.
Yeah, this is a speculation, and not everybody is happy if I say that. I happen to know the director of the zoo, Artis Zoo in Amsterdam, a big zoo. And he opened my eyes for biology in species fairly close to the human, like tigers and baboons. And he says in wildlife, there is, I think, except for 2 exceptions, menopause does not exist. It does not exist. So there again, ovaries are made to last lifelong. But when they are brought to the zoo and they get much older, then they start to have postmenopause. So basically, I think we created the zoo for mankind.